I've spent a lifetime bending so no one would notice the cracks. Every word I swallowed, every moment I stepped back. I believed it was enough, that patience, that restraint, would be my shield. But the truth hit me like ice. Zoe Richardson, you've been invisible in the house that was supposed to be yours too. The laughter, the praise, the quiet dismissals. They weren't accidents. They were deliberate. And for the first time, I felt the weight of all those years pressing down and knew I could no longer stay silent. I would no longer wait. I would no longer shrink. The balance is about to change, and they have no idea it's coming. The rehearsal dinner glowed with that perfect kind of warmth people mistake for love. The chandeliers threw soft gold across the tables. The air carried the scent of cut lilies, and every glass clinked in practiced celebration. At the center of it all, Eleanor laughed, a polished, confident sound that drew everyone toward her. My parents leaned in, eyes bright, hanging on her every word as she described her wedding plans. The guest list, the flowers, the seating chart, as if each detail were a triumph. I sat at the far end of the table, hands wrapped around a glass of water that had long lost its chill. Around me, voices rose and fell in waves of approval, stories overlapping, toasts spilling into more laughter. I smiled when expected, nodded at the right cues, and yet the distance between us felt impossible to cross. It was as though a pane of glass stood between their world and mine, clear enough for me to see through, but thick enough that nothing I said ever made it across. Eleanor turned suddenly, her perfect posture never faltering, and tossed a small remark about my work into the air, casual and cutting. The table chuckled politely. Kevin, her fiancé, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward me for the briefest second before darting away. That was all it took. One flicker of discomfort, one reminder that no matter how much I achieved, it would never be enough here. I lifted my glass, let the water settle, and felt something shift quietly inside me. Beneath the practiced smile, beneath the years of quiet endurance, a different kind of calm began to take shape. Something precise, measured, certain. I didn't know when it would happen, but I knew this. The balance was already starting to tilt. The night didn't end when the laughter faded. It lingered, heavy and stale, clinging to my skin long after I'd left the restaurant. At home, the silence wasn't quiet. It was full of echoes. Eleanor's voice still rang in my head, describing her guest list, the crystal centerpieces, the designer who'd flown in from New York for her fitting. My parents had listened as if she were revealing state secrets, their pride tangible, glowing like candlelight reflected in glass. I watched from the periphery, the same vantage point I'd occupied my entire life. They didn't ask how I was. They didn't need to. In their world, my life had no sharp edges, no stories worth repeating. It was neat, contained, invisible. I let them keep that illusion because the truth, the scope of what I actually did, wasn't something they could begin to comprehend. Kevin caught my eye once, across the table. There was something in his expression that wasn't pity, but curiosity, like he'd stumbled upon a question he couldn't quite form. I held his gaze for a second longer than polite, long enough to register that flicker. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A small reminder that perception, once cracked, could shift everything. I sat back, tracing the rim of my glass with one finger. Every detail of that evening, the glint of silverware, the pattern of laughter, the way Eleanor's hand rested lightly on Kevin's shoulder, lodged itself in my mind. I wasn't just observing, I was collecting data, mapping fault lines, pressure points. Years of work had trained me to read a room faster than most people could finish a sentence. My family had mistaken my quiet for detachment, but in truth, it was calculation. Later that night, as I changed out of my dress, my phone buzzed. A colleague's voice came through, steady and low, discussing logistics for a project that was still under security review. Then came a comment that made me still. Your family still doesn't know what you do, right? It wasn't judgment, just fact. but it cut deeper than I expected. They didn't know. They'd never asked. And for the first time, I realized how deliberate that blindness was. The next morning, Kevin texted about some misplaced seating chart files, thinking I'd somehow handled them. He laughed it off when I corrected him, saying he'd assumed I worked in admin. I almost laughed too, but the weight of his mistake settled like a stone in my chest. It wasn't his fault. He only saw what my sister and parents saw, the quiet one, the harmless one, the background. I set the phone down, my reflection faint in the dark window beside my desk. The city was waking outside, but my pulse had slowed, my mind sharpening. Every instinct I'd spent years honing at work rose to the surface, calm, focused, certain. There would be no confrontation, no raised voices, just precision. I would walk into that wedding not as the shadow they'd shaped me into, but as the sum of everything they'd chosen to ignore. They wouldn't understand what they were seeing until it was too late to look away. The wedding began beneath the high glass ceiling of the reception hall, sunlight spilling through like something rehearsed. The string quartet played a careful melody, elegant and predictable, while servers moved like clockwork, pouring champagne into crystal flutes. I stepped inside quietly, steadying my breath, feeling the weight of every eye that turned in my direction. Family, guests, uniformed officers from the groom's side. Eleanor was radiant in her gown, every thread designed to draw the world's attention. She caught my eye, her smile just sharp enough to cut. I didn't need to hear the words to know what came next, but she said them anyway, loud enough for those nearest to her to catch the tone, if not the meaning. I wonder what she'll do to stand out today. A polite ripple of laughter followed, thin and hollow, fading as quickly as it began. I said nothing. My pulse slowed. I let the silence stretch, studying the room, the mirrored walls, the sheen of silverware, the restless flicker of candlelight. Kevin's gaze flicked toward me for an instant, uneasy but curious, before returning to the table. I could feel the shift beginning, subtle as the change in air before a storm. The officers at the far tables glanced my way too. Brief looks, the kind trained soldiers give when they notice something that doesn't fit but can't yet name. I lifted my glass, let the bubbles rise and fade. My parents smiled tightly, but the corners of their mouths trembled. They didn't understand what they were reacting to, only that something had changed. The tension was quiet, invisible to most, but to me it was deafening. Every note of the music, every brush of fabric against the marble floor, became part of the calculation. I adjusted my dress slightly, tracing the stem of the glass with my thumb, letting my eyes move slowly across the room. Observation had always been my weapon, and tonight I wielded it in silence. As the ceremony flowed into the dinner, I excused myself briefly, stepping away from the crowd and into the side corridor where the evening light spilled in pale ribbons across the floor. I opened my small bag, the smooth weight of fabric resting inside. My fingers brushed against the crisp line of my military uniform, the ribbons and insignia that marked every operation, every sleepless night that no one here would ever know about. It wasn't vanity, it was proof, evidence of the life they had refused to see. I returned to the reception hall just as the toasts began. Eleanor stood again, glowing under the lights, her words dripping with performative gratitude. Kevin smiled beside her, but his eyes had shifted, wider, more alert, tracing the small details of my attire. When I set down my bag, the soft clink of metal was unmistakable. He leaned toward his father, whispering something low and urgent. The general's expression changed instantly, polite amusement replaced by recognition. He looked directly at me. The room fell into that strange kind of hush that comes before an impact. Eleanor's voice faltered. Even the quartet hesitated mid-note. My parents exchanged confused glances, still smiling as if the force of habit could shield them. I adjusted the jacket on my shoulders, straightened the ribbons, and moved through the room with calm, measured steps. No dramatics, no words, just the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be seen. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Eleanor's face tighten, her practiced composure beginning to crack. The shimmer in her eyes wasn't joy. It was disbelief. Around her, officers began to murmur. Some nodded. Some simply stared. My father's hand froze halfway to his drink. My mother's smile dissolved altogether. In that suspended silence, every pretense collapsed. For the first time, I wasn't their quiet daughter or the overlooked sister. I was something they couldn't define, and that uncertainty terrified them. The balance had shifted, and everyone in that room could feel it. I entered the reception hall as the orchestra shifted into a softer melody, the kind meant to set a perfect tone for celebration. My heels struck the marble in slow, deliberate rhythm, and every sound seemed to echo louder than it should have. The air felt different now, sharper, electric, as I stepped fully into the light wearing my formal uniform. Each ribbon, each medal, gleamed under the chandeliers like small pieces of truth finally allowed to exist. At first, only a few people noticed. A whisper near the back, the quick stillness that follows recognition. Then it spread, subtle, collective awareness moving through the room like a current. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Heads turned. A colonel's wife nudged her husband. A young officer straightened his posture instinctively. I didn't slow my pace. Across the room, Eleanor froze. Her laughter caught somewhere between amusement and disbelief. She adjusted her veil, trying to pretend it didn't matter that the eyes of her audience were shifting away from her. Her smile, always so flawless, trembled at the edges. My parents tried to recover what little composure they could. My mother's smile became too bright, too forced. My father nodded stiffly at guests who had stopped talking altogether. I could read the calculation behind their eyes, panic mixed with denial, the silent plea for everything to return to the script they'd written. But there was no going back. The officers from the groom's side had begun to murmur now, exchanging glances. I caught fragments, words like commendations, clearance, classified work. Kevin followed their line of sight, confusion flickering into realization. He leaned toward his father at the head table, his voice low but urgent. The general's eyes lifted to mine, sharp and assessing, the kind of look that measures not appearance but substance. The music faltered slightly before recovering. I could feel my heartbeat matching the tempo, calm and controlled. I adjusted my uniform jacket, the fabric smooth and precise beneath my hands, then met the general's gaze without hesitation. In that suspended moment, everything in the room seemed to slow. Eleanor's expression shifted again, defiance slipping into confusion, confusion into dread. She didn't understand what was happening, only that she was losing control of her day. The light caught on my medals as I raised my chin. Guests began to whisper in earnest now. My father's expression hardened into disbelief. My mother clutched her wine glass as if it could steady her. I didn't need to say a word. The room was already speaking for me. Then, movement. The general rose from his seat. The scrape of his chair against the floor was louder than the music. Conversations died instantly. Every head turned as he stepped away from the table and began walking. Past Kevin, past Eleanor, the click of his polished shoes echoing in the stunned silence. He stopped directly in front of me, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. His eyes swept over my ribbons, then met mine with unmistakable respect. His heels clicked together in a crisp salute. "Ma'am, it is an honor to stand in your presence." The words cut clean through the air. Every sound in the room vanished, the music, the whispers, even the hum of the chandeliers. For a moment, time held its breath. Eleanor stood frozen at the front of the room, the microphone limp in her hand, her lips parted but speechless. My parents' faces drained of color. Around us, the guests began to murmur again, this time in awe. Recognition spread like fire through dry grass. They knew what those medals meant. They knew who I was, even if my own family never had. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I met the general's salute with a steady nod, the smallest acknowledgement of respect between equals. My stillness was louder than any triumph could have been. Across the room, Eleanor's composure cracked completely. Her perfect posture faltered. her eyes darting from the general to me, as though reality itself had betrayed her. My mother looked at the floor. My father's hands clenched at his sides. The moment stretched, pulsing with the weight of unspoken things. The hierarchy of the room, the order my family had built their lives upon, was unraveling in real time, and no one could stop it. When the general lowered his salute, he inclined his head slightly before turning back toward his table. The guests followed his lead, rising in quiet deference. The sound of chairs scraping against marble replaced the music, and then, applause. Soft at first, then stronger, filling every corner of the room. Eleanor's world, so carefully crafted, cracked beneath the sound. I stood in the center of it all, calm, certain, and utterly untouchable. The applause faded into a hush that felt heavier than sound. I sat, posture straight, hands resting calmly in my lap, the weight of 100 stares pressing in from every direction. The general took his seat beside me, his presence a wall of quiet authority. Around us, the chatter of guests remained suspended, as though the air itself refused to move until someone dared to breathe again. He leaned closer, his voice measured but sincere, recounting a mission I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, the data I had analyzed, the intelligence that had rerouted his unit, the lives that had been saved because of it. Each word was deliberate, reverent, the kind that leaves no room for pretense. I met his gaze, steady and composed. I told him I had only done what needed to be done, ensuring the right information reached the right people in time. Nothing more, nothing less. He nodded once, a soldier's understanding, before turning back to the table. Across the room, Eleanor stood frozen, her smile brittle and fading as every conversation circled back to me. My parents sat stiffly, pale and silent, realizing too late that their hierarchy had collapsed in a single gesture. Officers whispered my name, some with recognition, others with awe. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The power wasn't in being seen, it was in finally being understood. The room never fully recovered from the silence that followed. Even as the music returned, it sounded hollow, misplaced, an afterthought trying to fill space that no longer belonged to it. I sat quietly, the hum of conversation returning in cautious fragments, every whisper circling back to what had just happened. Across the room, my parents avoided eye contact, their faces strained with the effort of composure. Eleanor stood beside Kevin, her hands clasped so tightly around her bouquet that the flowers bent beneath her grip. My phone buzzed on the table, a message from my father, then another from my mother, both stiff, polite, and painfully cautious. They wanted to understand, to know what it all meant, as if knowledge could give them back the control they'd lost. I read each word once, then archived them without reply. There was nothing left to explain that hadn't already been shown. Eleanor tried to smile when our eyes met, but the gesture wavered halfway. The defeat in her face wasn't anger, it was disbelief. The slow, unbearable awareness that the hierarchy she'd built her life on had collapsed in front of her. Around us, the officers had begun to speak my name softly, not as gossip, but as recognition. The shift was complete. The illusion that had defined my family's world was gone, and in its place stood the truth they'd never cared to see. The following weeks passed in a blur of briefings, reports, and quiet precision. The world outside the Pentagon's walls moved fast, but inside, time obeyed a different rhythm, measured, deliberate, disciplined. The long conference table gleamed beneath the white light, the air humming with the low tension of decisions that could shift entire regions. My colleagues spoke with purpose, their confidence resting not in image, but in competence. Here, titles were earned, not inherited. Respect was silent, but absolute. I stood at the head of the room, pointing to a satellite projection, outlining the framework of an ongoing operation. The generals and directors listened closely, their pens still, their expressions sharp with focus. There was no applause, no performance, only understanding. When the meeting ended, one of the senior officers nodded to me, a small gesture, but one that carried weight. That was the kind of acknowledgement that mattered. Walking through the corridor afterward, I caught my reflection in the glass, a composed figure in uniform, calm, steady. I adjusted the collar slightly and let the quiet pride settle. This was my world. This was where I belonged. At home, a new message waited from my father. The tone was gentler this time, cautious, almost reverent. I didn't open it. Some things were better left unanswered. Eleanor hadn't reached out since the wedding. Silence, for once, felt like the most honest thing between us. I no longer needed them to understand. Their approval was a currency I'd stopped trading in long ago. The value of who I was didn't live in family dinners or polite conversation. It lived in the trust of those who depended on my work, in the clarity of my decisions, in the quiet respect earned without spectacle. I stepped outside into the afternoon light, the air crisp and bright against my face. For the first time, the weight I carried didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. And as I walked toward the next meeting, a soft, unhurried smile found its way to my lips. The balance had shifted for good, and I didn't need anyone to see it to know it was mine.